Lifelong Learning, A Taste of PILLAR 2 are short presentations taught by PILLAR instructors in partnership with the Pikes Peak Library District. This program is made possible as the result of a grant from Next 50 Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding innovative, mission-driven initiatives that improve the lives of older adults and their caregivers. Welcome to A Taste of PILLAR 2 presentation. My name is Sandy Halby, and we'll talk a little bit today about a couple of my favorite Western artists, Charles M. Russell and Frederick S. Remington, artists of the American West. This is one of my favorite Charlie Russell paintings, and this is a Bronc to Breakfast. This is one he did in watercolor, and he did this very similar one on oil, A Camp Cook's Trouble. And this is real close to my heart because supposedly my grandfather was on this when this incident happened, and Charlie Russell actually painted this from his own experience. And supposedly, like I said, my grandfather's in there somewhere because he actually was on the same trail ride as Charlie Russell when this incident happened and gave Charlie Russell the idea for the painting. This is one of Frederick Remington's more famous paintings, A Dash for the Timber, 1889, an oil on canvas. I've actually never been to Fort Worth to see this painting, but I should love to go there someday to actually see it. I grew up in Montana, and I knew about Charlie Russell, who has actually lived in Great Falls, Montana, so I knew about him from a very young age. I always thought he was just a very, very famous artist, and didn't know that he was not as famous as Frederick Remington. Remington was much more well-known, especially back east than Russell. And I didn't really realize that until I lived in upstate New York. And I lived there in 1989 when Montana actually had their Centennial stamp. I went to the post office to buy the Montana Centennial stamp, and the postmaster got me my stamps, and he says, "Isn't that nice? They put John Wayne on their stamp." Well, I was very offended because that was Charlie Russell on the stamp. Being from Montana, I knew that. And this was actually, the stamp was taken off of a self-portrait that Charlie Russell had done, a self-portrait that he called Charles M. Russell and Friend. And I want to point out that big butte that's in the background there. Charlie Russell had that butte in the background in a lot of his paintings. Not to be outdone, though, Frederick Remington was on a stamp also. He was on the 1940 10-cent stamp for the famous American series. And this is a self-portrait that he did of himself on his horseback there. Self-portrait on horse that he did on oil on canvas. So it's quiz time here, although normally PILLAR classes don't have tests. We're going to take a short quiz here. Russell or Remington? And here we have, both of them did mountain men. Russell or Remington? Well, the one on the left is actually a Russell and the one on the right is a Remington. But they're very similar. This one threw me. I would have said that this was a Russell, but this was actually a Remington. This one is a Charlie Russell painting. And these are a couple of the sculptures that they did. Very similar. The one on the left is a Russell, and the one on the right is a Frederick Remington, one of the most famous cowboy sculptures ever done. I think the title of that one is called Bronc Buster. And again, two very similar paintings. The one on the left is a Charlie Russell, and the one on the right is a Frederick Remington. And here's a couple more that, again, very similar paintings. The one on the left is a Remington, shows some cowboys with a grizzly bear. And the one on the right is a Russell, a couple of cowboys roping a bear. So you have two artists. You have Frederick Remington and Charlie Russell. We'll talk a little bit about Frederick Remington first. He was actually born in upstate New York. His father was a newspaperman and postmaster. He was an only child. He came from a family of horsemen. He was distantly related to the artist George Catlin. He was a very active child. He loved to hunt, swim, camp. His father really wanted him to be a soldier and really wanted him to go to West Point, but he was a very poor student. He'd rather be active, out in the woods, camping, playing sports, doing things that boys did. Early on, he had a habit of sketching everything, especially soldiers and cowboys. He actually imagined himself as being a journalist with art as a sideline. He did attend art school in Yale. He was the only male in the whole class, but he found drawing action figures like these two football players much more interesting than drawing the still lifes that he was forced to in his art classes. At 19 years old, he made his first trip west, out to Montana, with dreams of buying a cattle ranch and then perhaps a mine, realizing he didn't have enough money for either. So he goes back east, and he actually started a career as a staff artist at Harper's Weekly, which was a popular pictorial newspaper with the largest circulation in the world. It publishes his first illustration, but at that time you had artists, and their art was redrawn by staff artists. And this was the first one that Remington did, and it was redrawn by staff artist William Rogers. It would be a while before Frederick Remington actually had his own art featured on Harper's Weekly. Still dreaming of the West and ranching life, in 1883, he goes to Peabody, Kansas, and buys a quarter-section sheep ranch. He rides a horse named Terracotta, who he loses in a horse race. And he's viewed as an Eastern playboy of sorts, just kind of out there playing at being a cowboy, playing at being a rancher. Not really well thought of out in Kansas. His enterprise fails, and he puts his land up for sale and auctions off all his livestock. He goes to Kansas City, Missouri, becomes part owner of a hardware store and a silent partner in a saloon. He marries a lady named Eva Canton, and they move to Kansas City together. He spends all his time sketching. Eva Remington, however, finds out that her husband's a silent partner in the saloon, gets real upset about that, and moves back east. She's not happy about that at all. Remington takes 3 of the paintings that he does, puts them on consignment in an art store that's run by W.W. Finley in Kansas City. All 3 paintings are quickly sold. This gives Remington the idea that maybe he can really make a living from his art. He loses his investment in the saloon, he loses investment in his hardware store, and he leaves Kansas City. He goes back east, reunites with his wife, and they move to Brooklyn, New York. In Brooklyn, he starts to take his art career seriously. Again, he's really thinking maybe he could do something with his art. He attends the Art Students League of New York, and his art comes to the attention of Collier's, and again to Harper's Weekly, which launched his career a couple of years earlier. He meets with Henry Harper himself, and soon begins to seriously work as a staff artist for Harper's Weekly. This is one of the covers that he did on his own. In his first year as a commercial artist, he earned about $1,200 for 25 illustrations that appeared in newspapers and periodicals. That $1,200 was a good wage when you compare it to the annual wage for a school teacher, a factory worker, or even a minister. In 1886, his first work to appear solely on his own was the Apache War Indian Scouts on Geronimo's Trail. And this is the illustration that appeared on Harper's Weekly. You can see that that's very similar to a painting that he did. Remington also traveled to Arizona, Mexico, and New Mexico for Harper's Weekly, not only for the illustrations, but as a journalist. He makes extensive notes in his journal and employs a Scoville detective camera to make reference photos for his various subjects. He befriends Lieutenant Powhatan Clark, who subsequently assists the artist with gathering additional material, including taking photos for the artists. This is the Scoville camera that he used. Scoville had revolutionized photography by making it accessible for amateurs. Remington learned how to operate the camera and develop his pictures on the go. This used glass plates for the photography process. These are some of the photos that were taken by Frederick Remington of subjects out in the West when he was in Arizona and New Mexico. Using photography was controversial. Scorned by fellow artists for being untraditional, it was almost like cheating. But Remington's response was, the artist must know more than the camera. The horse must be incorrectly drawn from the photographic standpoint to achieve the desired effect. He was also criticized for his choice of color palette. And that's demonstrated in one of his most famous paintings, The Dash for the Timber, that we saw earlier. The horse movements here are exaggerated, and you can see the bluish gray color of the shadows. In fact, the horses here are so dramatically drawn. The only time a horse will have all 4 feet off the ground is when it's in mid gallop and the feet are gathered underneath the horse. Yeah, there's the Sally Gardner is a series of photos that were done to actually show that the only time that a horse actually has all 4 feet off the ground is when in mid stride is when all 4 feet are gathered underneath the horse. You can see that Remington has some of his horses have their feet outstretched out in front of them and they have their feet off the ground. The horse will never have that in actual stride. But in order to achieve the dramatic effect, that's the way Remington drew this. So even though he had photographs and used photographs of horses and men, he over-exaggerated in his art. And he was also criticized, like I said, for some of the color palettes that he used. Like this bluish gray, he got criticized for using that for the shadows. This is another one of his, dismounted the 4th trooper moving the led horses. You can see the exaggerated motion of the horses and the exaggerated stride. They're all off the ground and they're striding there. So it's very exaggerated, but it does lend a very dramatic element and a movement to the painting. In 1887, Remington received a commission to do 83 illustrations for a book by Theodore Roosevelt. And this really elevated Frederick Remington's renown, if you will, as an artist. And Roosevelt had similar Western adventures to Remington, losing money on a ranch in North Dakota, but it gained experience which made him an expert on the West. So if you put the two together, Remington and Roosevelt, they just knew everything about the West that there was between their adventures and their art. So this assignment gave Remington's career a huge boost and forged a lifelong connection with Roosevelt. Between 1887 and 89, almost 250 drawings of Remington's were published, which is a remarkable record for an illustrator. Remington went back to Montana and Canada. He went to the Southwest again. And in 1888, his earnings were about $8,000, which was a huge amount of money for that time period. So he was doing quite well as an artist. And in 1889, he began work on a commission to create over 500 illustrations for a deluxe edition of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Song of Hiawatha. During the 1890s, Remington took frequent trips around the US, Mexico, and abroad to gather ideas for articles and illustrations. His military and cowboy subjects always sold best, even as the Old West was kind of playing out. Gradually, he transitioned from a premier chronicler artist of the Old West to a most important historian and artist. In fact, a lot of historians are going back to some of these old paintings that he did and the old paintings that Charlie Russell did to look to see like the uniforms that they wore, the equipment that they had, some of the details. So it's not only just art, but it's a historical record. In the 1890s, Remington partnered with Owen Wister, who actually wrote The Virginian, and he attempted 2 novels. They were not successful. He rarely depicted scenes in gambling and dance halls like you see in Western movies. This was one of the rare ones that he did inside a saloon. He also didn't draw women. I read somewhere, I think that he only did like 7 paintings that had women in them. 7 art pieces that had women, aside from the Longfellow. I think it was the Longfellow that he only did like 7 women. This painting, A Misdeal, is a rare instance of cowboy violence indoors that he ever did. So he was very confined to doing the outdoor type art. And then there was a chance remark that made him think of sculpting. He had no training in sculpture, had never done any of it, and an artist friend helped him construct his first clay model, Bronco Buster. And I'm not a sculptor. I don't know anything about sculpting, but I read that it's very technically hard to depict a horse on its hind legs. And evidently Remington did this with ease. It was just a natural for him. And after several months, he had a plaster cast made, and then bronze copies were made, and they were sold at Tiffany's, quite successful. And this Bronco Buster became just an absolute success, one of the first Western sculptures that was ever made. He also went to Cuba and did journalism and art for Cuba. And this is one of the pieces, Remington in Cuba, for Collier's Weekly. And then he did Cuba in wartime with illustrations by Frederick Remington. Near the end of his life, he actually moved to Connecticut. But in the final 2 years of his life, he dabbled a little bit in Impressionism. He said that he regretted that he was studio bound by virtue of his declining health, and he couldn't follow his peers who painted in plein air. And toward the end of his life, he got very depressed. In fact, at one point, he took numerous paintings out into his front yard and he set them afire and burned them up. He was very depressed. And, you know, good Lord knows what we lost there that he burned up. And in December 1909, he had a pain in his belly. He was 48 years old. It was his appendix, and he was operated on at home. He recovered for a short period of time, and then he passed away. And his funeral was held in Canton, New York, where he's buried in his family plot. So that's a bit about Frederick Remington there. He painted over 2,750 paintings. He wrote 8 books, even though he was not a successful artist. He sculpted 22 or 25 statues, depending on which source you have. And the bronze castings, the molds were all destroyed when his wife passed away. So there's none left. The Bronco Buster, one of the originals though, is in the Oval Office. Now let's talk a little bit about Charlie Russell. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was born in 1864. He was a self-taught artist, drew from a very young age, just like Remington, always sketching, always drawing. At 12 years old, he won several awards at local events, fairs, and competitions like that. His father owned a brickyard, and he dreamed of his son taking over the business, but Charlie Russell would have none of that. He wanted to run away to the Wild West, so at 14, he actually ran away from home. He was caught and returned home. His parents sent him to a military school in New Jersey, but that didn't last. He ran away from there. At the age of 16, he left school and went to Montana to work on a sheep ranch, but it didn't take him too long to realize that sheep herding wasn't for him, so he got fired. But he fell in love with what the area in Montana called Judith Basin. And you can see in this picture, there's some of the buttes there that he fell in love with. In fact, you'll see these buttes, like I said, in a lot of his paintings. Incident at Square Butte, you can see that butte in the background. Here's another one of the buttes in the background there. A mountain man named Jake Hoover took the young man in when Russell was just 16, and Russell lived with him for 2 years in the mountains, so he actually apprenticed under a mountain man. When he returned to paid cowboy work, he became a night wrangler, and so he could paint during the day. And this Jake Hoover, the mountain man who took Russell under his wing, he remained lifelong friends with Charlie Russell. And Russell worked as a cowboy for a number of outfits, and he documented the harsh winter of 1886 and 87 in a number of watercolors. In fact, that winter, that was the blizzard that, if anybody who's spent any time out in Montana, Wyoming, in that area, that winter was just the absolute most devastating blizzard ever of all time. Russell was actually working at the OH Ranch in the Judith Basin at the time. The ranch foreman received a letter from the owner of the ranch asking how the cattle herd had weathered that terrible winter. And instead of a letter, the ranch foreman sent a postcard that Russell had painted with a gaunt steer being watched by wolves. And the ranch owner showed that postcard to friends and business acquaintances and eventually displayed it in a shop in Helena, Montana. And that was how devastating that blizzard was. People were just, herds were just devastated by that storm that went through there, that blizzard, in such a hard winter. And Russell actually painted this oil painting off of that, Waiting for a Chinook, one of Russell's most famous paintings, talking about that blizzard and that winter. So in 1890, Russell stays with some friends and produces 12 black and white paintings that are called The Studies of Western Life. The text is authored by pioneer rancher Granville Stewart, who had a ranch there in Montana, and this was Russell's first book. And you can see Charles M. Russell, the cowboy artist. And there's that Waiting for a Chinook, which was one of the themes there. So in 1893, Russell works for a stock train going to Chicago. And he does this in order to go to the World's Columbian Exposition. He always had somebody going on the stock train to make sure that the cattle didn't lay down or trample each other. While he was out there at the World's Columbian Exposition, he exhibits a few paintings. And a St. Louis entrepreneur saw these, and he commissions 15 paintings, and it takes Russell several years to complete them. But those paintings are still in existence, and they are at the Amon Carter Museum collection, part of that. So in the fall, Russell's now confident, that fall of 1893, Russell's now confident that he can make a living painting, and he leaves the range to become a full-time artist. So it's kind of like very similar to Remington in that he figures now he's got enough, he can go to work as a full-time artist. So Russell meets and marries Nancy Cooper. They move to Great Falls, Montana. Nancy becomes his business manager. At the time, Russell was selling his paintings for like 10 bucks each. She immediately raises the price to like 50 bucks each. So she really did a good job promoting Charlie Russell's paintings. And about 1900 is when his career really takes off. And especially the St. Louis Post-Dispatch actually did an article comparing Russell to Remington, and Russell's career really took off after that. And same year, a reporter came out, meets Russell, visits his studio, and the resulting article, The Cowboy Artist, is so popular that the Denver Times reprints it. And in 1903, the first one-man exhibit of Russell's work opens in St. Louis. So then Charlie Russell was on his way then to fame. And this was his log cabin studio, and there's one of his signatures from 1909. He always put the little skull there with his signature, C.M. Russell. And this is Charlie Russell at work in his studio. So in 1905, he exhibits one of his bronzes here, Smoking Up, at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And in New York, he completes 3 ambitious models, which are cast. And he does the same thing as Remington. He takes them through Tiffany's. So there's a lot of parallels between Remington and Russell. This is Counting Coup, and then Buffalo Hunt, a couple of another sculptures of his. In 1907, Russell has an operation to have his appendix removed, kind of like Remington, although Russell recovers very slowly. He quipped to a friend, "I'm feeling fine since the doctors trimmed me, but I'm still some sore." And he signs this letter, "Yours without an appendix." And you'll notice on this letter, there's the drawings there, the Russell drawings. He did that a lot with his correspondence. He would have little drawings on his correspondence, and supposedly, my grandfather did some correspondence with Charlie Russell, and one of my uncles supposedly has a letter with a Charlie Russell drawing on it. I've never seen it, but supposedly my uncle has that. This is some more drawings that he did. You can see the little drawings that he has there, but you can see the drawings that he has there and the drawings on the envelopes. Charlie Russell was famous for doing that in correspondence with friends. So in 1912, Russell delivers his commission, Lewis and Clark Meeting Indians at Ross Hole, to the Montana House of Representatives. This is Russell's masterpiece, and this depicts the September 4th, 1805 meeting of the Corps of Discovery, the Lewis and Clark expedition, meeting some Flathead people. And Lewis and Clark are actually in the background, and Sacagawea is portrayed there, as well as Toby, one of their interpreters. And this is an absolute fantastic painting. If you ever get to Montana, to Helena, you really need to try to see this. This is actually in the Capitol building there. And you can see in this picture, if you look off to the right side, you can see there's two figures standing there, three actually. There's Sacagawea and then the two, I don't know if you can see, my mouse is right there. You can see there's Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. And this is Lewis and Clark meeting the Flathead Indians there. And you can see how huge this painting is. It's just absolutely huge, it takes up that whole wall. And then this is Russell at work in his studio on one of his paintings. And he actually did a couple of books. This is one of his most famous, Trails Plowed Under. He was quite the storyteller. And this was when this was completed and on its way to the printer. He did this in 1926. He died at 62, probably due to heart failure. And in Montana, schools closed and thousands lined the streets, and especially in Great Falls, the city where he lived. He created over 4,000 works of art in his lifetime, and the state just shut down. He was the state's favorite son. And in fact, there's the Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge. And there's the Charlie Russell Museum that's in Great Falls, Montana. So two artists, they were from the same era, the same genre, the Western arts. So let's do a quick comparison here. Frederick Remington, born in 1861, Charlie Russell, born in 1864. So they were about the same age. Natural artists and sculptors, went to Montana, similar ages, in their teens, both married. Now Remington had no children. Charlie Russell and his wife, they had adopted one son. There was some, and I never found the reason why, they adopted one son, but there was some sort of family estrangement, and the son was estranged from the family and never heard from again. So major fame for Remington came at age 26, major fame for Charlie Russell at age 36. They both had appendicitis, 48 and 43. Remington died at 48, Charlie Russell died at 62. They both drew and sketched and sculpted, primarily Western subjects. Now Remington observed and photographed subjects. Charlie Russell worked on ranches and drew from his own experience. And that's really a major difference in their artwork. Quite often you can tell at a quick glance whether it's a Russell or Remington. Frederick Remington rarely drew women, and Charlie Russell did wonderful portrayals of Indians and pioneer women, especially Indian women. And Remington was prolific, if not a successful writer, and Charlie Russell was a renowned storyteller, but he only published one book. So, and it's documented that Russell first sees a Frederick Remington illustration in Harper's Weekly in the fall of 1887. That was the first time he'd ever seen any Remington art. And most critics hold the impression that Russell was a true man of the West who embraced the genre, while Remington was a New England tourist who rued his legacy as a Western artist. That's what some of the critics say. But the two artists were near contemporaries, with their reputations being so intertwined that during their lifetime, you have to wonder what they thought of each other. Nobody knows. They never wrote about each other. They never discussed each other. And Brian Dippy, an author of Remington and Russell, wrote that while the evidence is scant, the two authors likely only met once, possibly, when Russell visited New York City several years before Remington died. but there's no documented evidence that they ever actually did meet. And there was nothing that they ever wrote about each other. So isn't that just amazing? You'd think with the parallels in their lives, what they did, what they drew, but that's pretty amazing. So some of their art side by side. Here's Remington and Russell. There's Remington with the buffalo hunt, and that's Buffalo Bill Center of the West is where that one painting's at. And here's Russell's buffalo hunt on the right. And you can see how similar the topic is. One of the things that was pointed out to me too, you can see in Remington's, you just have just the grass, but in Russell's, you've got the sagebrush, the flowers, the rocks, a little bit more detail on the ground, if you will. Same with this one, Remington, A Cold Morning on the Range. And then you Russell, you've got the Bronco Buster. Remington, Victory Dance. And again, you can see the exaggerated stride of the horses there that Remington did put in for the action. And then Russell, you've got his 1914 Return of the War Party. Very sedate pace of the horses. And there's Remington, the Stampede. And then Russell, Heads and Tails. And you can see the rope is caught underneath the horse's tail there. That's going to cause some excitement. And here's another Remington, The Importance of Ponies. And again, you can see the way that Remington used that blue-gray shadow color. And then Russell's Outnumbered. And then one of Remington's, a little bit more Southwest influence there. And then Russell's In Without Knocking. And there's Remington, The Blanket Signal. And then Russell's Smoke Signal. And then just a couple of their sculptures. Again, very similar. And in conclusion, just to visit a couple of my favorites, there's, you know, the Broncos to Breakfast. And In Without Knocking, I love this one. A lot of detail in this one for Charlie Russell. And then, of course, the last one is, you know, the Lewis and Clark meeting the Flathead Indians. So there you go, Charles Russell and Frederick Remington, you know, quite a couple of artists there that we have. So very interesting. And I hope you take the chance to explore both their art and take joy in both their art and their Western topics and do a little bit more investigation. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation for Pillars, A Taste of Pillar 2. And thank you.